and welcome to Bronx Talk. City Island, a 1.5-mile strip on the easternmost part of the Bronx that houses 4,300 residents, is much beloved for its restaurants, of course, and its quaint small town feel. It also has a rich nautical history, but let's face it, transportation-wise, it's isolated. And maybe even more significantly, as a small historic island, it is, to pun badly, a sitting duck for flooding, especially as the effects of climate change increase. So tonight we'll talk to a couple of residents as well as a shoreline expert to drill down on how some of these issues can be addressed. Please join me in welcoming the president of the civic group City Island Rising. It is John Doyle. Nice to have you back on our program. Also, a board member of City Island Rising is David Diaz. And nice to have you with us, sir, for the first time.
Yes.
And joining us on Skype, a coastal resilience specialist, New York Sea Grants, Katie Graziano. Katie, she'll be joining us a little later. Oh, there she is. She's on Skype. You can see her here. Katie, nice to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Mr. Doyle, let's start with you.
Absolutely.
Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that tonight's program was inspired by our colleagues at CUNY TV, who covered these very same issues on a recent edition of their wonderful program, Diverse City, and that focused on City Island. So we thank CUNY TV for their fine work. We got to make sure we credit where credit is due. So, Mr. Doyle, let's start with the notion of City Island as a transportation desert. We've got one bridge in and out of the island, essentially one bus route. Obviously, there's no subway line on busy holidays and even normal Friday and Saturday evenings. The traffic goes all the way back practically to Pelham Parkway many nights. And not to mention many City Islanders, like the gentleman next to you, work in Manhattan and have massive commutes every single day. City Island Rising believes one answer to this issue is to establish an additional ferry stop to the New York City Ferry Soundview line. How would it work? Can it work at City Island, that it comes from Classen Point and makes its way past Throg's Neck and to City Island?
Sure. Well, of course it's feasible because they've done a report on this. The Economic Development Corporation did a report on this. They showed it was feasible. The bathy levels were conclusive. They could build out a dock from 2 different points on the island. Obviously, this would need to be open to discussion. And they also determined that parking would not be a serious concern because people are not going to drive all the way to City Island to scour for parking if there are other spots like Throg's Neck and other areas where there's a parking lot available to them. They're going to go where it's most convenient rather than so out of the way. Having said that, the one thing the report did indicate is that our ridership levels were low. Now, we've put in some clarifications and some clarifying comments because we want to know, how did they arrive at the determination? When was the study done?
When you say our ridership levels, you're talking about
City
for
Island.
the Throg's Neck? Oh, ridership levels of people from City Island.
Yes. They measured it about 400 daily. So the curious question is, how did they arrive at that conclusion? And also, was this taken during COVID, or when did they measure this? So that's what we're trying to figure out.
A couple of items. First of all, the minute you start talking about building a ferry landing, it costs something. Do we have an estimate? Do we know how much it might cost? Or are we not at that point where we can start evaluating?
We're not at that point yet. Other comparable ferry stops have went for about $5 million to build out. City Island might be a little bit more because you might have to build the pier a little longer. Having said that, in the federal infrastructure bill, as I shared, I believe there's about $150 million for urban ferry routes. Obviously, the city of New York having one of those urban ferry routes. So this is something we should look into, we should examine.
The City Island Civic Organization is not down with this idea. No. They say there's no place to physically put it, that an old dock that had been there many years ago is gone. The topography has grown over and has changed, and says there's no place to put a ferry stop on that part of the island. Do you agree? Is it?
I tremendously disagree.
You
and
disagree.
The fact of the matter is that the Economic Development Corporation said that a ferry dock there was feasible. They didn't. They're the experts, and I would be guided by expert opinion.
One of the things that I thought, and I've ridden the ferry several times from Classen Point, and actually once or twice from Throg's Neck as well, is the parking issue. At Classen Point, I thought they made a dreadful mistake not including a parking lot. And I know when I went there, and I don't live in that area, but we wanted to take a ride or a weekend ride on the ferry, you had to find parking who knows where in the neighborhood. That's the last thing you want, is bring more cars into somebody's neighborhood. That's not really solving a transportation problem. And then you had to walk, and I don't know how far we had to walk to get to the ferry. If you go to the Throgs Neck ferry, there is a parking lot, but you have a pretty good walk to go through the Ferry Point Park there to get to the ferry stop. The City Island Civic Organization says, well, wait a minute, nobody's going to come like from outside City Island, drive all the way across, so you're not going to need parking for them. And we're going to talk to Mr. Diaz here. People like Mr. Diaz live on City Island. Are they going to walk all the way across? Are they going to, I mean, you live about halfway through the island. Or are they going to drive cars and with no place to park at the end of the island?
I mean, of course they're going to walk if they need to, because the commute they're walking is going to be lesser than their commute to Manhattan. They're going to do whatever lowers their commute. And we're talking about dramatically lowering the commute for our neighbors, our residents, our friends, and our families. This would get our commute down to something, I believe, about 45 minutes. People now are spending 90 to 120 minutes. That's more time at home with their families, more time at home to contribute to the community, and more time shopping in our stores.
Well, let's get a first-hand opinion of that. Mr. Diaz, now you said that your son goes to school on
33rd and Lexington.
33rd and Lexington. At least it's the east side. You don't have to get him to the west
We
side.
specifically planned that.
Okay. And now what about you also go downtown?
I work on 42nd.
How do you get downtown? And since you live in the middle of the island, it's not right near the ferry stop. How would you get to a potential ferry stop?
Well, there is a bus that runs. Fairly regularly every half hour. And the same way that I'd wait for that bus to go to Pelham Bay Station, I'd wait for that bus to go down to the end of the island. Or if it's a nice day, I would just walk.
How do you get down there now?
I walk.
No. How do you get downtown now?
So I either do.
You don't walk downtown
no,
to City Island.
What I do is we sometimes take the 29 to the 6 train down to Grand Central, or we have to drive.
The 6 train to Grand Central is unless you get the express.
And God
somewhere.
love MTA, but it is tough. It is a tough ride. That 6 train.
And you would welcome a ferry stop.
Oh, absolutely.
Mr. Doyle, the economics of the ferry, the city was it was revealed the city was think of how crazy this is. They charge you $275, but without telling anybody, the de Blasio administration was subsidizing every ride about $13 without anybody knowing. Does that have to change? Maybe it's a larger question than whether it needs to be at City Island or not, but it's still a sticking point. You can add 400 more riders. Do the math, it starts to be a lot of money.
Of course, there's going to need to be a re-examination of the finances. For example, I know they just increased the ferry rate, I believe, to $4 recently. And maybe on weekends, if people are coming out here for a commute, you could charge them $5. I think the price point is flexible. And again, Orchard Beach is something you've covered very much over the years. That's going to start becoming a year-round facility. So possibly building out a ferry point there as well also makes sense, which is a consensus point of view. But in your right mind, do you think they're going to build a terminal from Orchard Beach, which there were issues that were in the EDC report, but they're going to build that ferry and then it's going to go past City Island, the seaport of the Bronx? Come on.
And not stop there.
Yeah.
This leads into it. I knew we were going there. This leads into something that you and I have discussed privately and maybe even in some civic meetings about the notion of a trolley from Orchard Beach, which is something that I think is just way, way past time that we ought to do that.
Yeah.
Do you see that? In other words, if we put the ferry stop and then you had a trolley, which saves you the problem of waiting for the bus. Now, that's not to say the trolley can be as frequent as maybe the commuters might like, but it certainly would help in the evenings. I talked about traffic backed up to Pelham Parkway. Where are we at? Can we vote here and make that happen?
I believe the Bronx Chamber actually owns a trolley that they used to do the trolley tours on Fridays. My good friend of mine actually right out of college was doing those tours for a while. So they do own the trolley. Again, this is meant to be a starting point in the discussion, and something that has really been great, at least from my point of view, is the fact that, we have over 1,000 people signed on to this petition. We were at the street fair a few months back. People who live there are signing on to this. And I do think there's a little bit of a generational divide. The younger professionals who need to get down to the city or want to visit or have people visit them want the ferry. People who are a little bit older are a little bit more critical about it.
So what would be the next step? And by the way, we're going to bring in Ms. Graziano and Mr. Diaz, who's somewhat of an expert because got high boots, and so we're going to talk about the shorelines in a moment. But let's just finish with this. What would be who's the one that has to vote yes?
sure.
I guess it would be the mayor, but
The mayor and the city council. I mean, this is entirely subsidized by the city. Obviously, there are federal funds they can draw on, and we want to make sure there are different revenue streams, of course. Congestion pricing coming in obviously provides another revenue stream, which is obviously tied into the state and the federal government. But I think the next step is that there will be hearings in the city council about how to improve the ferry service, and people should show up and make themselves heard.
Local council member is Marjorie Velasquez.
That's correct.
She's for it, or no, we haven't weighed in yet.
I believe she at one point was for it in campaign advertisements, but my understanding is she is not for it now.
Not for it?
Yes.
Well, that's going to be a hurdle for you to try to move that
Yes.
forward. Do we know why, or I don't want to ask you to argue?
In the
other side.
published reports, the rationale that was given, as I recall, was that everyone in the neighborhood wasn't for it. But my counter to that was that we have elections, and
Right.
Neighborhoods usually have pretty closely divided elections too. But we accept, kind of that for the greater good that there was one person in charge, and I think this is something that would get a lot of support. So I'd encourage you to reconsider.
Well, we'll find out. Maybe we'll get a chance to ask her about it.
There we
Mrs.
go.
Diaz, let's just talk about flooding. Before we even give you a chance to speak, you appeared on that CUNY TV show,
Yes.
which I thought was a very interesting, for those of us who may be not familiar with it. Today we're recording this on kind of a rainy day. It's raining out there. It doesn't appear to be that big that's going to cause flooding. But what I thought was interesting about what we're about to see is that you were talking about every day with the tide, with the high tides and low tides, it creates a flooding situation. So let's take a look at this. This is, again, thank you to Diverse City on CUNY TV, and let's take a look.
We can, like, on a regular tide, we can see the water just up to the wall.
Right.
In a moon tide, it'll be a little bit higher, maybe 2 feet, 3 feet higher. So that's when we'll see it come off the sides and into the street.
Right.
And then when we have storm surges, right? When we even the remnants of hurricanes, where we have another increase on top of that, we have another 2, 3 feet of rise. Then we'll see the water come right over, and that's when we'll see it, as far back as that stop sign.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
crazy. Because
So there's a daily item where the high tide comes in, and all of a sudden you're dealing with a storm surge of some sort.
It's almost expected. Like, people just, it's there.
And there are a number of photos that we have of flooding.
Over 1,000.
Talk to me a little bit about what the issue is. Explain to me what your concerns are and what you think maybe solutions are. And then we're going to bring Ms. Graziano into the dialogue to get an expert opinion, so to speak.
Well, no, I mean, I am a big proponent of the Green New Deal, and we are facing a climate catastrophe at some point. We live on an island, one way off, one way on, like you spoke earlier about, right? If in fact that we do have this continuation of sea level rise and flooding, I mean, it poses a danger to our way of life there. So that's why I do believe it's critically important.
How, aside from the daily tides, which create some issue, but presumably at least dealt with in some
Dealt with,
form,
right.
how often does City Island get flooded to a point of real problem? I mean, rains, we all get puddles, and we know
Right.
that happens.
So
how often is it a problem?
So we've seen more often now with just on a regular rain that we do see flooding in lots of different areas, right? The one area that we were talking at was on Ditmars. That area at times can be a lot worse than others. It can be overbearing, yes.
It has affected people's properties?
Yes, absolutely.
I think now it's time to bring in Katie Graziano, who is with Sea Grant, New York Sea Grant. Katie, nice to have you with us. Ms. Graziano, talk to us a little bit about what is a New York Sea Grant, and what is it that you're working on that would be relevant to the people of City Island?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So New York Sea Grant is a statewide organization. It's essentially a partnership between academic organizations like Cornell University and Stony Brook University, and local organizations that work with communities to bring science into community decision-making and conversations about issues like coastal resilience and urban flooding.
Well,
so
let
go
me
ahead.
just ask you about that. So what you've done is study it. Now, you don't have any governmental budget or anything like that to say, well, this is what we should do. So let's use City Island as an example. What have you found? What have you folks seen at City Island that concerns you? And then, of course, we can begin to break down what we really have to do.
Right. So the science of sea level rise shows us that the level of the ocean has risen already 1 foot in the last 100 years. And that's the kind of changes that we're already seeing in places like City Island, across New York City, including around in Jamaica Bay, where I do a lot of work. And that sea level rise is accelerating. So what we're seeing now, since there's already been a foot of sea level rise, we're going to see that again in the next 50 years, there'll be another foot of sea level rise on top of that. And so working with organizations like City Island Rising, who have been awesome partners through the Community Flood Watch Project, we're working with residents to document the impacts of flooding. And so it's taking photos and submitting them to a database where we can really collect all this shared information about the sea level rise impacts, the urban flooding impacts that are already happening as a way to help spread the word, kind of like raise awareness about what's already happening, and also help bring people together to come up with solutions for the future.
How concerned are you? Specifically about City Island, I mean, we're all concerned about climate. I'd like to think we're all concerned about climate change. But when it comes to City Island, how concerned are you, let's say, in relation to maybe other parts of the Bronx that are Soundview and Throgs Neck that are on the shorelines as well? Of course, there are some we had the flooding at the Major Deegan Expressway as well. How concerned are you?
I think it's hard to talk about concern in absolute terms because there is a lot of sort of, not uncertainty, but there's different paths that can go forward. So we know that the sea level is going to rise, but we don't really know how many severe storms there will be and what direction they'll be coming from and how they'll impact different parts of the city. Something that gives me a lot of hope is the amount of community organizing that I've seen in City Island. I think communities coming together and building these social networks and kind of being preemptive about the issues that we're going to see in the future, that's the best thing that you can do to prepare for these kinds of issues.
One of the stats that came through to me was 26% chance of 1/4 of City Island properties could see flooding within the next 25 to 30 years. One of the things I can ask you both about, gentlemen, is the whole notion of drainage. That on some level, if you can get some of this off the streets, and it would just flow into the sewer system or wherever, we could do better. So, Mr. Diaz, what are your thoughts about the sewer system?
It's terrible, unfortunately, right? And that's sort of the essence of some of the flooding that we see just on some of the other streets, the regular streets, is the lack of drainage. They get overwhelmed, and now that the rains are. Rains now are harder and more water in a shorter period of time, and they can't, they can't handle it.
Mr. Doyle, New York State awarded Save the Sound $400,000 for Hutchinson River watershed planning in the Bronx. We're hearing a lot of planning. I'm the kind of person who wants to see something done.
Same.
But you got to start with a plan. Is that the kind of grant that helps identify, along with what we hear from Ms. Graziano? Is that the kind of thing that helps?
So they're similar, they're related issues. They're a little different in the sense of that the water quality out in the Long Island Sound, particularly in the Western Narrows, is some of the most polluted water in the Long Island Sound. That comes up from Mount Vernon as well, which obviously has a lot of sewerage problems. They've been well documented, as well as the CSOs in the Eastern Bronx. So we've got to change the whole equation here. And the best way to do that is to come up with a plan. Once we have a plan, we can go for funding. And people need to keep in mind, we have the Inflation Reduction Act, we have the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, we have the Mother Nature Bond Act. We have billions, if not trillions, of dollars that are going to be floating out there. And the more studies we have, the more provable, tangible information we have, working with great people like Katie, and trying to document these things, the better case we're going to be able to put forward that City Island is deserving of these funds. For example, the New York State has a Climate Action Council, and City Island wasn't in an original plan to get some of these funds. It would be considered a disadvantaged neighborhood. because of the photos we took and some of the testimony both David and myself submitted, City Island now is considered an environmentally disadvantaged neighborhood. So that's going to put us as a frontline community able and eligible for some of these funds.
Ms. Graziano, I know you do a study and then you say, well, this would be nice, and we've just talked about funding. Let's talk about, do you have an idea in your mind how much money we need? Were some of the infrastructure monies that have been promised and are being delivered allegedly a good start? Are they an end result? I mean, how do you see paying for all of this infrastructure work? You know, I said very easily, well, let's just fix the drainage system. Now you're talking about New York City sewers. This is a very large thing. So what's your kind of ballpark here on what financially needs to be done to get it right?
So my expertise is really the science behind sea level rise and coastal resilience. So I can't speak very well to the financial elements of it. I do know obviously it's very costly, but something from studying climate change, that something that comes up again and again is that whatever it is that is the investment is worth it in the long run. Yep. It's just a matter of being kind of creative and taking these opportunities when they come up to make sure to invest in.
Then I'll turn it into a science question then. How large an issue is the drainage? Now let's just put it this way. I understand for a normal rainfall or a heavy rainfall, yes, drainage is a problem. But if we're talking about real flooding with, God forbid, another major hurricane or something like that, the drainage is, it's like pouring, a quart of water into a small cup. It's just going to overflow. Mm-hmm. So where is the priority? Is the priority in the drainage, or is are we building walls? Like, what do you recommend if we were to give you a couple of $1 billion and say this is for City Island? What are you going to do? You're going to build walls? What do you do?
That's a very good observation, because it is a problem coming kind of from two sides. It's both the coastal protection and the rainfall and the rain-driven flooding. And City Island is seeing both already. So one of the things that I have learned a lot about recently is natural and nature-based features. There's a lot more attention coming to these. It's essentially, instead of using things like storm drains and sewer systems and hard seawalls and bulkheads, everything that's built out of concrete, it's really turning to nature and the kinds of functions that nature has always served to protect communities from the impacts of the shoreline. So that could look like your question about drainage. Absolutely, this is a huge issue in City Island. It will get worse both with rainfall and also as sea level rises. There's sort of a meeting in the middle where the rain has nowhere to drain to. So
I want to just ask you this. It's fascinating to me, and certainly if there's a natural, you talked about using nature. How would you use? I mean, to me, I hate to say build a wall. That was overused over the past 10 years. But if you don't build a wall, what is nature going to do other than so far keep flooding and make we're getting warmer out here?
So things like salt marshes actually absorb a lot of energy from waves and tidal changes. So restoring salt marshes, oyster reefs. I know there's an organization in City Island that is already doing a lot of work with restoring oyster reefs, which helps protect the shoreline as well. So there's plenty of kind of examples of these interventions being used across the city and across the nation, and I think City Island would actually be a great place to utilize some of these.
I'm going to your last question then for the program. Are these realistic solutions? Has science proven them to be realistic solutions that have been used, that can be used? And of course, then can we do them at a scale large enough to? As maybe the gentlemen here know, I have been on the boat with the people putting oysters into the Sound right next to City Island, so I've seen it happen. But how effective is it? We did some of that. We're still complaining.
Yeah.
So, that's a great question. It is effective, and there are studies that show that, for example, after Hurricane Sandy, the places that were natural salt marsh or restored areas protected communities better than places that were just concrete bulkheads. So there is evidence to show that it's an effective solution. In New York City, you're right, there is an issue with kind of scaling and space because there's only so much space that we have at the shoreline. And that does become a bigger question about land use and planning
Of
for
course.
the future.
And listen, we're talking about City Island, but we have many communities in the Bronx, whether it be Throgs Neck or Soundview or over there in the West Bronx by the Harlem River, that need this kind of attention. Katie Graziano, thank you for joining us this evening. You're a great guest, and I'm guessing we're going to get back to you because this is not going away very quickly. Thank you. John Doyle, you wanted to say something. You were kind of raising your hand there. What do you
I
got?
always have a lot to say.
We know that. That's why you're here. It's
But
Bronx
as we
Talk.
talked about Tropical Storm Ida, and we're going on the year anniversary of that, almost the 10-year anniversary of Sandy. There's been no coastal resiliency measures, no infrastructure improvements for City Island, for really most of Pelham Bay Park. There's been chronic disinvestment in Pelham Bay Park. It's almost a Three Stooges routine amongst government agencies to find out who maintains these things. WFUV did a segment. They showed that our emergency routes frequently flood, and no government agency is taking responsibility.
Your final point is we gotta just do it.
I figure raising the issue up here on your show would be helpful.
Last couple of words from you, Mr. Diaz.
No, absolutely. I think this is something that we have to do, and the cost and all of that stuff should not matter, because what it's going to cost us later on, that is going to be.
You really summed it up nicely. This is kind of what I wanted to put out, is that this really is a priority. If homes get washed away, I mean, we're seeing it, of course, in the Midwest and in other parts of America. If homes get washed away, kind of what do we have?
Exactly.
David Diaz, thank you. John Doyle, thank you.
Always a
Katie
pleasure.
Graziano, thank you again. Folks, we also thank our producers, Rebecca Hammock and Stephen Powell. Our director is Benaya War. They do fine work every week, and we're here with you every week. Now, next week, a special show on Bronx history that will feature the Bronx neighborhoods of Parkchester and Van Nest. You will learn about all of those neighborhoods. So we'll see you next week. Good night.